Hello. I don't know if there's anybody out there, but I'm going to go ahead and start. I just had sort of a frustrating thing on Twitter just now. Roll had shared, there was a clip of a woman who is in government in Mexico, and she was sort of touting that, she was introducing legislation for Bitcoin, and it was going to be so wonderful for financial inclusion for poor people. And nobody understands, like, people just don't understand about the impact finance space. And so that clip had been retweeted. She was on a stage somewhere making this announcement. And again, it was centering Finclusion, like for the poor, digital currency for the poor. And so that had been like retweeted, quote tweeted 60 times. And so I went and I have this article. Actually, I'm going to be speaking about it with the What's Left podcast next week about conditional cash transfers in Mexico. And and it lays out how in the 90s, they really, under the auspices of social good, were providing cash payments, but conditional on women, pursuing certain approved things for child health and child education. And I think, as we all know, those systems are not looking out for kids or women at this point. So anyway, I just got into like a bit back and forth with a couple of people who responded. But largely, they were all investing. They were like emerging markets. These are people who were doing emerging markets. And so they were like, I'm quoting, saying like, don't let us colonize your children. Like, they're coming after Mexico's children, and it involves surveillance play tables. And, the woman's like, oh, well, I'm in emerging markets, and you need to like share reputable sources. And I'm literally sharing the white paper from 2012 where they talk about securitizing social impact bonds and trading them on global marketplaces for children. So these people, they're just in total denial about what they're doing. It makes me mad. So if you're on Twitter, like, go and like retweet or engage, because this woman literally, she's sitting in, like, she's connected with something like Chain something in Manhattan with creative, innovative ideas, bringing innovative ideas to market. And really it's about turning children into commodities. So anyway, okay. So now I will get back to tonight. We're Rainbow's End. We're getting close. We're making progress. So it's like, we're in the thinner part now. I'm going to do, I think these chapters look like they're pretty short. And so I'm going to try to do 3 tonight. Anyway, thanks for coming in. I make it hard to deny things. I'm like, did you not get the invitation when they ring the NASDAQ bell? And did you not hear what Goldman Sachs is doing? And do you not see this report that says that they're planning on securitizing all of these impact finance deals? And how is it that there's maybe like a handful of us at this point still talking about this 2 years later? It makes you wonder. I'm just going to say, like, if you follow me and you appreciate my work, poke and embarrass all of those other alternative media journalists who will not talk about this, because at this point, it's just crazy that they're refusing to. And I think it should tell you something about who to be paying attention to and who not to be paying attention to. So, okay. So chapter 22, this is called The Bicycle Attack. Alfred waited a decent time before entering the room. No sense in making noise that Rabbit stooges might hear. What did I tell you, Doc? We're in. Rabbit danced a merry jig around the caisson. The optical fiber that was giving Rabbit such joy was invisibly thin, except when the light caught it just right. Vaz nodded. He had a different communication success to celebrate. He had reestablished his Milnet link across the Pacific. Braun to Mitsuri, Vaz. U.S. Homeland Security looks calm, Alfred. Closed message. Alfred watched the stats streaming by. They were from the Alliance's listening posts. The national security scene was indeed calm, even though the library disturbance had brought crowds to the UCSD campus. Rabbit had created the perfect paradoxical distraction. Almost perfect. The affair was growing too large. Vaz knelt beside the box that marked the termination point of Thomas Parker's FiberLink. The box was a scamful bridge. On one side, it accepted the uncertified data streams from Parker's criminal computers, and on the other, it was a good citizen running under the government-required secure hardware agreement. Or environment, secure hardware environment, SHE. It hid Parker's data in innocent packages that wrapped in all the licenses and permissions needed to survive on the SHE of the internet. Altogether, it was not as secure as Vaz's Milnet, but it would suffice for most regions of the contingency tree. Alfred tweaked the box, and now he was getting Parker's video direct. At last, he was truly a local honcho. The video from Parker's laptop bounced around without a bit of program control, but Vaz recognized the equipment in the walls and some of the physical signage. Rabbit Stooges had breached the biolab security, even more impressive. The delicate game of fooling the lab's automatic security was a continuing success. How far are they from Goal A? Alfred asked Rabbit. In fact, that was the site of his private research program. He would pretend to inspect it along with the others. Almost there, Rabbit waved airily. They'll start dropping off equipment in less than 10 minutes. Don't worry about a thing. Alfred looked out through his surface viewpoints. Most of my mobiles are trapped on the north side of Gilman Drive. In conventional combat, his bots would simply seize the local infrastructure and come storming across. But instead, they were balked by the human and automobile traffic along the roadway. At least one had been struck by an auto. Rabbit spread its paws in mock sympathy. At least it didn't bring out another carrot. You can't have everything. Hasek and Scoochie fans have done everything we could pray for. The human staff is out of the labs. The riot is sucking in local comm resources. It'll be a regular black hole by the time it peaks. And it all looks totally innocent. Don't tell me you could mask this operation any better. Vaz let that brag go unanswered. He'd come to realize that irritation was the kindliest emotion he could feel for Rabbit. He sat with his back to the concrete caisson and tracked ongoing developments. He could see that the Department of Homeland Security people were watching closely, but they were watching the wrong places. Analyst consensus was that Rabbit had tuned things to match DHS paranoia perfectly. Maybe Alice Gong had been taken down, but undetected by Alliance monitors. Underground, Rabbit Stooges had almost reached Goal A. In 10 minutes, the investigation of the site would begin. In another half hour, he could begin to report his doctored results. And after that, it was simply a matter of getting out and letting the Stooges be captured. Things were going so smoothly, he could have stayed back in Mumbai. Not that he was complaining. Analyst red flag. Someone reviewing stale video had noticed something. Alfred brought up the flag report. It was a 10-second snippet from one of his mobiles on the north side of Gilman Drive. 2 children with bicycles. They were standing by the roadway and looking at something that might have been a crushed mech. Those are the 2 I saw earlier. Queries spurred outward. Who were the children? What was the mobile of one? Was the mobile one of Alfred's? Ugly answers came back. Rabbit didn't have access to the Indo-European analysts, but suddenly the creature sat up and gave an admiring whistle. Well, I'll be dipped. We've got company, Doc. Miri left her bike in the rack outside Pilchner Hall, and Juan insisted on bringing his fancy fold-up into the building. And when Miri pointed out the absurdity of this, the boy just shrugged. My bike is special. Lena and Zoo were no longer visible, but Lena's voice followed them through the wide-open doors. There should be better security, Miri. I don't like this. It's the emergency overload behavior, Lena. Unoccupied rooms stay locked. The others are open. Lena said, and we can't see you anymore. The sudden drop in data was very strange, but Miri wasn't going to say that. Instead, I bet high-rate forwarding isn't supported except for around the library. Zoo said, yes, we'll have spectacular views from there. The main corridors in Pilchner Hall had searchable viewpoints. There were glimpses of Robert's recent passage. That was enough to guide them downstairs, but now there were places where Juan and Miri could talk only to each other. It's like a haunted house. Juan's voice was hushed. His hands reached out and grasped hers. She didn't shake him loose. She needed him to keep cool. Certainly losing connectivity in the middle of an office building was an eerie thing. They came around a corner, and there was a glimmer of connectivity, enough for a sming. Miri to Miri Gang, I think we're getting close, close message. Lena to Miri Gang, first we lost video, now we can barely talk. Get out of there, close message. Miri to Miri Gang, it's just temporary. I'm sure Wick Bell is shifting extra coverage into place. Close message. How bad could an entertainment riot get? Miri imagined Lena was having a similar discussion with Zhang in a certain car driving around the north side of campus. Grandmother seemed truly anxious. Zhu to Miri Gang, I agree with Miri, but give Lena and me regular reports. Close message. Lena to Miri Gang, Yes, even if that means you have to backtrack. Where is Robert now? Close message. Mary to Mary Gang. Real close. I can ping him direct. Close message. The twisty hallway was brightly lit, just like you'd expect during a network brownout, and Juan's bike coasted along almost silently, all folded up into portability mode. He only had to give it a push every so often. Their footsteps and the flank snicking of its tires were the only sounds. They took another corner. The hall was narrower, with intersections every few feet. This was one of those temporary makeovers that crazy architects for a day like to do. For a few dozen feet, they had high-rate connectivity. Ads and announcements appeared on the walls. Someone's medical research project loomed like a monster on the left, and she gave Lena and Zoo a continuous video as they turned another corner and then lost all outside connectivity. Juan slowed, drew Mary to a stop. This place is really dead. Yeah, said Mary, and they walked forwards a few more paces. Except for her point-to-point link with Juan, she might as well have been on the far side of the moon. And there was another corner ahead. She pulled Juan forward. Around the corner, the corridor ended at a closed door. I can't ping your grandpa anymore, Mary. Mary looked at the map she had cached. This has to be where they are, Juan. Even if we can't get through, we'll just pound on the door. And suddenly, she didn't care too much about embarrassing Robert and his friends. This was too strange. But then the door opened, and a man in dark clothes stepped out. He might have been a janitor or a professor, but either way, he didn't look friendly. May I help you? He said. How did they find us? Rabbit made a warning gesture. Not out loud, Doc, it hissed. They might actually hear you. It seemed to look over Alfred's shoulder. I'd say they were following the girl's grandfather. Vaz glanced at the heap of clothes that lay by the caisson. He sminged back, voice format. Those clothes are still transmitting. Well, of course, to the outside, it looks like the old guys are just sitting around, maybe playing cards. I'm faking everything, even their medicals. Alfred realized he was grinding his teeth. That goo kid is such a pain, Rabbit continued. Sometimes I think she... Alfred waved his hand and the creature disappeared, along with all public network communication. There was now a deep local silence, a hard dead zone. But his mill net link was still in place, a fragile chain that led through his mobiles to his stealth aerobot and thence across the Pacific. Alfred's analyst pool in Mumbai was estimating 60 seconds until the dead zone got serious attention from campus police and fire departments. Braun to Mitsuri Vaz. This can't be sustained, Alfred, closed message. Vaz to Braun Mitsuri. I'll clear the dead zone in a few seconds, closed message. This is why successful missions had a local honcho. He probed the mobiles that had made it into the building. The children were about 30 feet away, well inside the dead zone, and still coming. He could hear them, right through the plastic wall. He glanced at the door. It was locked. Maybe he could pretend to be empty air while they pounded on the door. No, they'd just back off and call the police. Okay, time for direct action. Alfred set the two nearest mobiles into motion. These were network superiority bots with essentially no anti-personnel capacity, but they would be a distraction. And then he opened the door and stepped out into the hall, confronting the two children and a folded-up bicycle. May I help you? Mary tried to glare at the old fellow. Self-righteous indignation came hard when you're trespassing and trying to think of a good lie, and her link to the outside of the world was still firmly dead. Juan stepped forward and just blathered out the truth. We're looking for Mary's grandfather. We ping him somewhere behind you. The janitor / professor / whatever shrugged. There's no one here but myself. As you know, network connections were very unreliable this evening. The building shouldn't have allowed you down here. I'll have to ask you to go back to the public area. There was a sign by the door now, one of the standard biohazard symbols that covered a lot of the classrooms and labs in Pilchner Hall. You might think the public net was coming back up, except that Mary still couldn't probe beyond her line of sight. Juan nodded as if the old man made perfect sense. He walked forward a couple more steps, at the same time relaying what he saw back to Mary. The room beyond was brightly lit. There was some kind of hole in the floor, and she could see the top of a metal ladder. Okay, Juan said agreeably. He was fiddling with something on his bike, but point to point, his words were on fire. Juan to Mary. See the clothes piled on the floor beside the pit? Mary to Juan. Time to go. Get outside. Get where they could call the cops. She shrugged as casually as she could and said, well, we'll be on our way then. There was no way back and no way forward. Oh, the stranger sighed. No, it's too late for that. And he started towards them. Behind her, there was the snick of something hard on the floor, and she saw dark things scuttling toward her. There was no way back and no way forward. And then Juan made a way forward. He bounced his bike towards the stranger, and there was a screech of rubber. The wheels spun up with all the power from the Reagan brakes, and the bike exploded across the room, smashing into the stranger and the equipment behind him. Mary ran forward toward the pit. Come on, Juan. She knew where Robert must be and how she could put out the alarm. She scrambled over the edge, saw metal rungs. Juan! Mr. Janitor Professor was back on his feet, staggering forward. He had something pointy in his hands, and Mary was frozen for an instant, watching the pointy thing swing toward her. Orozco was such a runt, he couldn't stop someone like that, but he tried, and the bad guy staggered back, and the thing in his hand made a bright purple flash. Mary felt a numbing tingle across her side, and she tipped over the edge of the pit, managed to grab a ladder rung with the hand that still had feeling, but her feet swung through emptiness. She pawed with her numb hand, missed, and fell onto very hard concrete. All of her imagery was gone. Maybe her epiphany was fried, but she could see the circle of light above, and she could hear, "Run, Mary, run!" One shout was cut off by a meaty, crunching sound. Mary ran. The UCSD riot was the news of this is called In the Cathedral, so chapter 23. The UCSD library riot was the news of the evening. No doubt it would be echoing back and forth across the world for the next weeks, a new twist on the trajectory of public entertainment. It was also a bright spot on Bob Goo's situation board. Too bright. Bob watched the analysts, even people with specialties as remote as forensic virology, cluster around that cecal locust in Southern California. There are other things going on tonight, guys. The DEA raid in Kern County had triggered real violence in the Canadian North. That was outside of Bob's watch area, but it might indicate something more than simple enhancement drugs was involved. If not for the library riot, he'd be seeing dozens of theories floating up. Maybe the Kern County business was a cover for immigrant bashing. Maybe something more lethal than enhancements was involved. Analysts were great at such wild conjectures and equally great at feeding on them, reducing them to rubble, or finding solid evidence and drawing in the firepower that Bob Goo commanded. But tonight, well, the UCSD riot did have the taint of a classic diversion, covering something big and bad elsewhere in Kona Southwest. Alice had doubled the size of the analyst pool, and now there were specialists from the Centers for Disease Control and even folks from other watches. Normally, she would have groomed her unruly mob of specialists. She had the breadth and the depth and the charisma to bring even academic civilians into line. But tonight, Alice was part of the problem. Every time he redirected the group into a wider view, she drew it back. She was the one who diverted his virologists. There was a tight little cluster of bioscience types that grew brighter and closer, bandwidths rising. But Alice was not studying the riot per se, but its connections to the bioscience labs that surrounded the school. Except for the diversion of their night staff, the lab showed all green, and the harder she pounded on the lab network security, the cleaner it looked. It's the damn JITT. Alice had just completed her training for the biolab audit. They had been the most extensive JITT just-in-time training she had ever undertaken. At this moment, he'd guessed there wasn't anyone in the world with more knowledge of lab automation and associated research. I should talk to her direct. No more polite redirection. Hell, if she won't back off, I should relieve her. And those thoughts were much too like their recent fights at home. So it was Bob who drew back. He sat and watched the correlations, the statistical outliers. He moved his group members away from San Diego issues. They would be tripwires if UCSD was a diversion. The bioscience pool just got brighter. Alice had preempted CDC's genomics division. He would hear about that in the after-action meetings. He had a cold intuition. Tonight could be the night. The thing he personally feared as much as anything in the world, the possibility Alice always denied. Is she slipping away? What would a full-size JITT collapse be like for someone who had trained a dozen times more than the worst JITT head in a VA hospital? Do you hear something? Like what, Tommy? You know, like a distant thump. They stopped and looked back, and Winnie made an indignant noise. This was like the old days when Tommy was always working to increase the suspense of the illicit expedition. Tommy hesitated. He was leading from behind, so the fine fiber was paying out, wouldn't get trampled by the others. He listened for a moment more and then turned to catch up. Maybe it was nothing, but the fiber went dead for a moment, too. He glanced down at his laptop. It looks okay now. He waved them up to the tunnel in the dark beyond their little pool of light. Keep going. The first part of the tunnel had been very familiar, an eerie walk down memory lane. And then there was time now, more than 50 years past, when all of them but Carlos had explored the tunnels. Tommy Parker had been a smart-ass freshman then, showing off to a couple grad students who often wondered how they had been inveigled into such a harebrained expedition. As they walked further on, things became less familiar. Glassy tubes ran along all the walls. Robert saw signs printed on the walls, cryptic physical backup for nodes that wouldn't respond to his computer box. Thunk. Something white and the size of a volleyball whizzed by in one tube. Thunk, thunk. Similar traffic in the opposite direction. Pneumatic tubes had once been a sign of the brave new world. When Robert was a child, he'd seen such things in dying department stores. Why the pneumo tubes, Tommy? Well, this is where theory meets reality. Proteomics, genomics, regulomics, you name the omic, and it's here. And these labs are huge. And the local data traffic is 1,000,000 times what you'd have on a public trunk with the latencies of a home network. But they still need to look at real biologicals. I mean, sometimes they got to move samples, transport trays for short moves, pneumos for longer ones. GenGen even has its own Up Express launcher for shipping parcels to other labs around the world. Now Robert heard sounds from the darkness ahead of them, voices that never quite made recognizable words, clicking that might even be old typewriters. This is science? Carlos said, when I try to probe the local net, all I see are bare walls. I told you, talk to the lab net would make this scam way too complicated. The tunnel must know we're here, and they walked in a small pool of light. Behind them and ahead of them, the tunnel was dark. Yep, it knows we're here, but you might say that's only at a subconscious level. Robert was in the lead. He pointed at the wall just in front of the front edge of the light. What about these signs? The letters were physically painted on the wall. 5P as in Peter, B as in baseball, small p as in Peter, S as in Sam, large P as in Peter, R as in rabbit, O as in octopus, T as in Tom. Geno, and then 10PBPS multi. Well, that brought Tommy forward. Maybe it's the general genomics crossbar. He held his prayer wheel high, waving the fiber out and away from the others. The stranger was visible beside Tommy, but down here the monster couldn't quite locate itself. Its feet floated above the floor, and its gaze was wrong by 90 degrees. Tommy pointed his laptop so that its camera could see the lettering. I have to admit, the fiber link is handy. I can send video out to my consultancy. Invisible to Tommy, the mysterious stranger jerked a thumb at itself and grinned. Tommy studied his laptop's display for a moment. Yes, we have reached the GenGen optical crossbar. And he pointed down the side tunnel. Now, this is where things get tricky. Within 50 feet, the side tunnel had opened into something wider, something cavernous. In the shadows, something slanted into the heights. See that tower, said Tommy? That's GenGen's private launcher. These guys don't bother with the launchers in the East County. The clickety sound was all around them now. It came from the tops of the equipment cabinets. It had a pattern like poetry scanned purely for stress. At the end of a stanza, things actually moved. Light glittered from deep within matted crystals, and some of the cabinets had a physical label. MUS MCOG, Muse MCOG. The stranger danced among them, a fantasy from Tommy's laptop and the fiber behind them. But the fantasy was watching through the laptop's camera and talking, at least to Robert. The stranger pointed in the general direction of the crystals, the wonders of nanofluidics, a decade of old-time bioscience done in every shifting of the lights. How do you represent 1 trillion samples and 1 billion trillion analyses? How can art deal with that? It hesitated as if truly anxious for an answer, and then it was gone again, but it left behind its own labels and explanations. Robert looked at the ranks of machines, the tower almost lost in the distant dark. The place was a machine cathedral, but how to represent it? When it would take him years to even have a shallow understanding. The massed crystal was not spectacularly colored. Most of the fluid paths were microscopic and hidden within appliances that might have been oversized refrigerators. The stranger's labels floated randomly about, ghostly subtitles to some transcendent process. And yet it almost made him remember what he'd lost. Words burbled up within his imagination, words striving to capture the awe he felt. They walked down the narrow aisles, turning only when Tommy had told them to turn. Every minute or so, he would stop their progress and grab a few more gadgets from the backpacks. We got to install these just right, guys. Staying invisible here is a lot harder than in the tunnel. Tommy wanted the gadgets to set near comm nodes, which turned out to be way back within the fluidics crystals. Robert did most of the quote-unquote installing. Carlos would boost him up over the cabinet, and Robert would wiggle back so near the Glassworks that he could hear tiny, tiny clicks and fluid hissing so faintly that it might have been seepage. In their millions, those sounds added up to the larger atmosphere of the room. In one case, Robert lingered and noticed that the gadget itself took care of the final installation, sliding away from him deeper into the Glassworks, as if its underside were a miniature transport tray. "What are you laughing at, Goo?" Blount's voice came from below. "Nothing." Robert crawled off the cabinet and dropped to the floor. "I just figured out a little mystery." They continued on. Most of the cabinets were labeled Dross McCog now. They were making faster progress, mainly because Carlos and Robert had figured out the gymnastics of the operation. "That's the last of them, guys." Tommy's gaze shifted from his laptops to the fluidics crystals. "You know, it's really weird that all the node locations were so deep in the lab equipment," he said. The mysterious stranger slipped in front of Tommy and waggled greenish fingers at Robert and Carlos and Winnie. "That's not a mystery to follow up on. Why doesn't someone suggest that we get with Tommy's great plan, eh?" And so no one said anything for a moment, but Robert guessed two things about what they had just done. It was what they had really come here for. It was how the stranger might make good on his promises. Maybe Carlos and Winnie realized something similar, because suddenly all of them were talking. Blount waved the others silent and turned to Parker. "Who knows, Tommy? You said that this was subtle. It might take weeks to figure out just how everything fits together." Yep. Tommy nodded, oblivious of the stranger's satisfied look. "Time for analyses later." And he glanced down at his laptop. In any case, this was the hard part. Now we have a clear run to where Huerta stores the shredder. Next section. They didn't set down any more gadgets. Tommy's laptop advised speed, and therefore so did Tommy, and whatever the mysterious stranger planned for Jen no longer needed them. Robert glanced back. Winnie was out of breath, almost trotting. The stranger must have given him some special encouragement, and behind Carlos, Tommy spun his prayer wheel, drifting the spider thread out behind them. And suddenly, the concrete floor gave way to something that bounced back against their feet, and the sound of their steps was like tapping on a vast and tightly fitted drum. "When does a tunnel fly?" said Tommy. "When it's really a tunnel in the sky." And suddenly Robert realized where they were. This was one of the enclosed walkways that came off the side of Rose Canyon, just north of campus. Right now they were standing in a tube 70 feet above the brush and manzanita-covered hillside. And then they were back on concrete. Ahead was another cavern, and this one was almost empty. Huertas country. Mary ran, but a spotlight followed. No, that was just normal tunnel light. She slowed and stopped and slid up against the wall and looked back, and no human followed. The entrance hole was the only other light, and now it was some distance behind her. Juan. She watched and listened. If no one was coming after her, that might mean UCSD security was still working down here. She tried to probe the walls. She called 911. Again, nothing. Maybe the bad guy had permanently zapped her epiphany. She shrugged up some test routines. No, it wasn't dead. She could see her files, but every local node was ignoring her. And then she noticed the pink flicker at the edge of the diagnostic, a wireless response that her epiphany would normally have discarded as too distant, too erratic. And a second passed. Heavens knew how many retries, and she got an ID. It was Juan. His wearable. "Mary to Juan, please answer, close message." No reply came back, and she couldn't check his medicals without more access rates. Abruptly, Juan's light flared and died. Mary sucked in a breath. Mr. Janitor Professor was still up there. He had whacked poor Juan again. No, to be precise, he had whacked Juan's gear again, and maybe to prevent Mary from forwarding out through it. For a moment, Mary drew in on herself. It was not a good thing that all her planning and leadership could come to this. Alice never seemed to have these problems. She knew what to do next. And Bob, well, sometimes Bob made mistakes. He was the one who always seemed uneasy about uncertainty. I wonder what Bob would think of all of this. I wonder what Juan would do. Mary looked down the tunnel away from the entrance. It was dark, and it wasn't perfectly quiet. There might be voices chatting conversationally, never quite making words. Robert and his library friends were down here, surely being run as cat's paws by Mr. Janitor Professor. How can I wreck his plan? Mary got to her feet and ran quietly up the tunnel, still trapped in her own private pool of light. No sign of Robert, and none of the mumbled voices sounded quite right. She passed occasional cross tunnels. Small things whizzed down transparent tubes. Some minutes later, and still no sign of Robert. Mary read as she ran along. She had cached plenty about UCSD and the biotechs. There was proprietary and security stuff she couldn't know. But the cross tunnels led off to particular labs, 300 acres in 17 separate chambers. Mary's run slowed to a walk and then came to a miserable stop. Robert could be anywhere. How much control did the bad guys have down here? Maybe I should just start shouting. Mary's run slowed to a walk. Faintly behind her, there came a new kind of sound, soft hammers pounding on a metal drum, but it was a cadence like footsteps. And suddenly, she had a very, very good idea of where the others were. Now, if only she could match that to where she was. Mary turned and headed back. Okay, so this is chapter 24. I think this will be the last one for tonight. It's called The Library Chooses. Sheila Hansen's night crew came out of the forest on the path of the great snake of knowledge. You guys should definitely look up the University of California, San Diego snake sidewalk by the library because it's a real thing and it's kind of crazy. There's a short video about it. The hassock spiders were already there and they had the high ground. Tim rolled and walked his Bodish army right to the edge of the enemy force. Night crew, geez, they're all real. Close message. The spiders, that is. Most of the humans were real too. Hesekian knights and librarians were thick behind their robots. Round the north side of the library came more Scoochie reinforcements, supporters from the Oceanography Library at the Scripps Institute. But the Hesekians had their own reinforcements. From cameras flying across the library, Hugh could see those latest arrivals chasing the Scripps people. So far, there had been little property damage. The mechs looked sinister enough, and the humans were mostly milling and shouting. Sheila was still doing pretty well with her "We want our real books" chant. Something big and virtual came rushing out of the Hesekian side and onto the Buddhist no man's land. It was 12 feet tall, the best dangerous knowledge that Timothy Hugh had ever seen. Half librarian, half night guardian. The creature was Hassek's central paradox, and now it capered almost to the edge of the Scoochie lines and made a grotesque face, tongue long and pointy like a Maori demon. And when it shouted, every Scoochie heard, but the message was customized to the listener. Oi, Timothy, you think you're a lesser Scoochimu. Lesser indeed, and all you Scoochie moppets be trashy children's things, shallow and unworthy before our depth. Dangerous knowledge waved at the Hassek critters around and behind it. That was the usual slur against the Scoochimu mythos, and it always made the Scoochies mad since naive outsiders might be deceived by the claim. There were counter chants from the Scoochie ranks. Hassek is just a counterfeit Pratchett. And that set the Hassek people into a rage, since, of course, it was only the simple truth. Hugh pushed past Sheila and Smale and the rest of the night crew until he stood at the forward edge of his army. Up close, this dangerous knowledge was even more spectacularly detailed. Its taloned boots were artfully sunk in the muck beside the serpent path. Spiderbots hummed and hopped around their patron. The spiderbots were real. Where had the Seconds gotten such clever things and on such short notice? He pinged them, not surprisingly, nothing came back. And there was almost living suppleness about the way they scrambled over one another, surging and retreating. The gadgets looked like custom melds of the latest Intel and Legend model. Gen Regulomics was upgrading to something like this. He pinged them again, this time with his Gen technician authority. Holy shit. Hey, Hugh shouted. The Hasek bums have stolen Gen's equipment. And now they looked closely at the other side. He recognized fellow employees. There was Katie Rosenbaum. She waved her battle axe and leered at him. Rosenbaum to Hugh, we just borrowed them, dearie. He'd had lunch with Katie and her friends only yesterday. He knew they were Hasek sympathizers in Regulomics, so of course his crew had kept their plans under wraps, and all the while the treacherous Hasekians had been doing the same. Dangerous knowledge continued its merry dance through the spider troops, mocking the Scoochie's surprise. It shouted, indignant be ye now, wee Hewling. Could ye be just cheated with too little imagination? What ye brought is old and slow and well matched to the petty concept of your imagery. The art behind dangerous knowledge was astoundingly good, without precursors, but whoever was pulling the strings was even more impressive, certainly a world-class professional actor. For a moment, the Scoochie ranks wavered, and their mob of virtual supporters began to melt away. In the view from above, Hugh saw more Hasekians piling up around the other side of the library. If the balance shifted too far, the Scoochies would end in humiliation and defeat. Then Sheila Hansen's voice came loud on the public venue audible across the entire participating world. Look, the greater Scoochimu. Behind Hugh, one of the forklift mechs stirred to life. Let me see. This goes on for a bit. Okay. The forklift mech stepped forward as delicately as could be imagined for a machine that was 12 feet tall, with a center of gravity that was now over 6 feet up. It certainly wasn't running autonomously, but he hadn't thought Sheila could drive this well. Its foot platters descended slowly, giving humans and chirps and salsipeds plenty of time to clear out of the way. It was impressive, but it was just a forklift. And then Hugh realized he was still watching it with his driver's view, meshing with the belief circle view. It was... Well, Sheila had morphed the blue ionoped into something even more spectacular than dangerous knowledge. Now it was the greater Scoochimu, the most popular of the Scoochie critters. In its short career, the greater Scooch had been the subject of refurbishments, spin-offs, spin-ups, mergers, and attempted government takeovers. It was the maximum hero to millions of schoolchildren across the poorest lands of Africa and South America. The champion of the little people, improving their place in the world. And this vision of it tonight topped everything in sight. What's more, this vision had 4 tons of haptic truth clunking along inside. The greater Scoochimu reached the edge of the Scoochie lines and advanced into the Spiderbot territory, and now it moved fast as it was stabilizers and motors could carry it. Whoa, who's driving that thing? It danced through the Hasek robots and bellowed insults at dangerous knowledge. Knights and librarians, Poofalongs and Dwelbs and Babalagas and everyone on both sides went wild. Special effects blossomed in the air above them, and then the shouting got even louder. The robots surged into combat. Hugh looked at the melee of robotic special effects. Mega Munches and Zorro shows were coming out of the bushes, and Sheila was throwing their reserves into the maw of battle. The mech battle was real. When the greater Scoochimu tap danced on the backs of spiderbots, fragments of carapace and leg flew into the air. In his technician's view, he could see damage reports. 20 Regulomics spiders were listed as non-responsive on the lab's real-time roster. Dozens of his tweezerbots were destroyed. 3 of the sample carriers had lost mobility. Hugh to Hansen, borrowing robots is one thing, Sheila, but a lot of those are going back as junk. Sorry. Sheila was at the other end of the front. It looked like she was trying to get the robots to advance into knights and librarians. On Tim's end, the greater Scoochimu had already accomplished some of that by dancing toward the edge of the real human players. Hansen to Hugh, not to worry, management is happy. Take a look at the publicity, Tim. Closed message. His coworker and the virtual thousands pushed forward. In the network view, geez, Gen was getting coverage like you couldn't pay for. Better than in the 20th century when millions were forced to watch just what the few had decided what was important. There were backbone routers in the UCSD area that had run out of capacity. Well, that wouldn't last long since there were endless ad hoc routers and dark fiber everywhere, but the whole world was here tonight. Step by step, the Scoochies advanced. We want our floor space. We want our library. And most of all, we want our real books. Belief circles normally completed from within based on their own popularity, but here tonight was a grand exception. Belief circles fighting each other directly for the attention and respect. In minutes, they might burn up months of creativity, but reach an audience beyond all their earlier dreams. And whoever was driving the Greater Scoochimu chatted with Hugh directly. Greater Scoochimu to Lesser Scoochimu, your mechs are the thing, my man. Bring them on. Closed message. Okay, Hugh fired up the other forklift. He often dreamed of kicking ass with one of these monsters, and he walked carefully through the friendly lines, drawing the smaller robots along behind him. And from somewhere across the world, Scoochie artists draped the forklift every bit as brilliantly as the Greater Scoochimu. But this vision was mercurial as smoke. Hugh's forklift was tricked out as mind-some, the ambiguous spirit that sometimes helped Scoochimu when the enemies were at their wiliest. Its vapors both lagged and led the real device. Dozens of helpers and helper programs made sure the effect was always in place. The forklift's hull was a dark composite plastic. Unless you looked carefully in the real view, you couldn't be sure just where the robot might really be. Tim took advantage of all of this stomping, like a steel mist across the Bodish battle zone, high-fiving the Greater Scoochimu and treading with ambiguous location through the knights and librarians. The Scoochie chant boomed from the forklift speakers. We want our floor space. We want our library. And most of all, we want our real books. The advance was a combination of beauty, surprise, and physical intimidation. The Hasek forces fell back, and Hugh's chirps and salsipeds hustled to claim a new ground. But Katie Rosenbaum's critters still outnumbered them and were far more agile. The Spiderbots raced backwards, keeping a battle zone between the contending human forces. Smale to night crew, keep after them, closed message. As Hugh walked forward behind his forklift, mind-some, he was also looking down from above and tracking the reviews. There were more than 100 million people watching the two belief circles had created. Not quite a game and not quite a work of art. This was a contest where you won with imagination and calculation and impudence. So far, the world thought that the two sides were matched as to imagination, but the Scoochies were way ahead on calculation and impudence. They had created real physical destruction all around and among real humans. Yard by yard, the battle moved round the library. The Scoochies now occupied the South Esplanade, the principal access of the campus. On the roads around campus, cars were bringing people from all over town, the physical counterpart of the far more numerous virtuals. 40% of the backbone routers were saturated. The audience had surged past 200 million. Hundreds of thousands were players tricked out with new imagery from the depths of Hasek and Scoochie design. The participants, real and virtual, spread out around the central hub that was the university library. Seen from journalist viewpoints, 1,000 feet up, the conflict looked like a strange spiral galaxy, its arms glowing the brightest where the battle was fiercest. There were others present, invisible, but for the reporting of the entertainment trade journalists, the movie and game people, maybe 100,000 professionals. Some watched the watchers, sampling and polling. Others were down in the Bodish battles, collecting designs. He could see the spoor of Spielberg Rowling, game happenings, Rio Magic, and the big Bollywood studios. Tim could see more, and after all, he was running Gen's equipment. He could see nets that merged with the background, collecting and subtly affecting. They must belong to the Fantasist Guild, the richest artist cooperative in the world. Their motto, we don't need no stinking middlemen. And of course, the police were here, half a dozen jurisdictions from campus cops to the FBI. Greater Scoochimu to Lesser Scoochimu. Hey, my man, we have 10 minutes to win belief and decision, and then we're going to start shutting down. Close message. Alfred watched it all from under Pilchner Hall. Rabbit's Riot had emptied the biolabs. The Indo-European inspection equipment was in place and already sending back results. Faked results, but that was Alfred's doing. The stooges who had installed that equipment were now well away from the Gen area, off where their eventual arrest would provoke diversionary suspicions. But We need at least 15 minutes more, said Alfred. The fake data stream from the investigation would complete sooner than that, but cleaning and getting out would take additional time. Rabbit shrugged. Don't worry, old fellow. I told Hugh 10 minutes just to keep him on his toes. Even after the campus police crack down, you'll have another half hour before the Gen crew begins to trickle back underground. Mitsuri to Braun. I think Rabbit is right about the timing. His library operation is a masterpiece. We couldn't have organized a distraction like this without pressing every red button in the American security apparatus. Braun to Mitsuri Vaz. The riot has grown too large, closed message. The traffic still blocks their mobiles. Without sufficient mechs on site, they hadn't been able to fully control Piltner Hall. And 2 unwelcome children had created the first real problem of the evening. Now one of those children lay unconscious by the caisson, right where Alfred had brought him down. Vaz glanced at where Rabbit sat on the edge of the pit, its furry feet dangling into the dark. What about the girl, Rabbit? Right now she's running around in the tunnels, out of control. Rabbit smiled broadly. So call me the Lord God of unintended consequences. When things get complicated, there are side effects. This is super long. 65, okay. There are side effects, and Mary Goo is just one of them. You're the local honcho. Why don't you go after her? Braun to Mitsuri Vaz. No, that would put you well outside our contingency plans. In fact, Alfred was tempted. Instead, he sent down just one mobile to track the girl. It might be enough to distract her, and if she caught up with the Stooges, then they had another option available, something that should surprise Rabbit. Out loud, Vaz said, I don't think so. Do you have other suggestions? The obvious, old fellow. Be flexible like me. Who knows what opportunities may develop? You can't locate Mary Goo, but big deal. That must mean she's nowhere that interests you and your friends, right? He waggled his ears inquisitively. Braun to Mitsuri Vaz. I want Mr. Rabbit out of here. He is trying to co-opt us and all the time distracting us with his impudence. Close message. And that could be very distracting. Rabbit had started on another carrot. The creature grinned around large incisors as it chomped away, as if to say, don't mind me, just swing as you please. From far beyond the walls, Alfred could hear the sounds of Rabbit's diversionary riot. Counterforce analysts reported to Homeland Security, was watching UCSD with intense interest, but otherwise calm. Gunberg and Keiko took that as good news. But does that mean Alice Gong is still functioning? For Alfred, that was the question of the moment, far more important than his run-in with the 2 children. In any case, it was time to get Inquisitive Rabbit out of here. It had to be done without making Gunberg and Keiko suspicious. Fortunately, Gunberg was already pushing in the right direction. Braun floated a needs and goals matrix into view. The colors were shaded to reflect probability, but it was strikingly pure for the library riot. Rabbit critical items glowed bright red, 100 tasks that only he could do if the diversion were to proceed. For the underground labs, there were a dozen Rabbit critical items, mainly involved getting the Stooges underground, guiding them around, getting them out of the operational area, and every one of them was some shade of green. Vaz to Braun Mitsuri. Good point, Gunberg. Mitsuri to Braun Vaz. Okay, cut Rabbit loose, but gently. I suggest you blame this move on your obnoxious remote colleagues. Grin, close message. Alfred gave Rabbit a smile. You're right, Mr. Rabbit. Some of us are sadly inflexible. Hey, no problem. Rabbit waved magnanimously. In fact, you have made things so safe for us down here. My bosses want you to concentrate on topside operations. What are you doing? Hey. Vaz reached down and unclipped the fiber optic line from its scamful bridge. And for a moment, the image of the rabbit was frozen, like some dumb graphic that had lost its remote source. Of course, Rabbit still had its internet link to here. This pause was a moment of simple astonishment. And when it passed, the creature hopped to its feet. Why did you do that? Its voice and facial expression were almost without affect. Apparently, Rabbit had never conceived the possibility of having to confront real surprise and embarrassment. The fiber optic plug dangled loosely in Alfred's hand. It took an effort of will not to flash a gloating smile at the creature. He slipped the line into the transceiver on his belt. What went in and out of the fiber would now go through his private millnet. Braun to Mitsuri Vaz. Bravo, Alfred. Mitsuri to Braun Vaz. Be nice. We still need him for the riot. Close message. Rabbit paced along the edge of the hole, its paws waving in a blur that might have been fists. You're breaking our agreement. The voice was still flat. Alfred put on his kindliest expression and spoke without a hint of triumph. Please, Mr. Rabbit, look at our agreement. We both need the other to profit, and we're each best in our own domain. The equipment is now inserted in the labs. If you will maintain the riot environment for a few more minutes, I will have everything we promised you. The rabbit stared expressionlessly. You need me down in the labs, surely. He isn't all-knowing. Conceivably, I'll keep you apprised of our situation. What do you say? There was a sudden cascade of expression across Rabbit's face, anger, and then a knowing smile, quickly covering up, as though the operator had not wanted it seen, and then an elaborate, overly patient sigh. Yes, the long-suffering Rabbit. Paranoia triumphant. Very well, I will bow to your wishes, which it did elaborately, dancing on the edge of the pit, and retreat to keep you safe from surface threats. A flash of herbivorous teeth. But I do expect all the agreed payoffs. You know my capabilities. I do, and I realize there may still be complications and attempts by you to create complications. One of our people will run liaison with you in your surface ops. Vaz to Braun Mitsuri. Keiko? Mitsuri to Braun. I'm on it. Close message. Rabbit gave a last flippant wave, and suddenly the little room with the plastic walls and the concrete floor was free of all taint of Rabbit. Alfred shut down the remaining internet links, and now there was just a pile of old clothes, the handcart, the hole in the middle of the floor, and their one human casualty. The comforting sounds of mayhem continued to waft down the hill from the library. Vaz to Braun. How does the lab data look? The inspection equipment had been transmitting for some minutes now. Were the lies being believed? Could Gunberg give up his precious theories? Braun to Vaz. They're 70% complete. We have a lot of post-analysis to do, but at first glance, these labs look innocent. Close message. Yes. Greater Scoochimu to Lesser Scoochimu. Forward now, my man. The Hasek bastards are giving way. Close message. And the Hasekians were falling back, at least in the area ahead of Tim Hugh, and he walked his forklift into the gap, crushing what spider-bots got in the way. The arc of contention had shifted round till he was almost due south of the library's main entrance. Here, the enemy was in retreat. The Scoochies had more real people on the ground, and that meant more backup for the visual effects. But the Hasekians had perhaps 200,000 folks from afar, compared with half that many virtual Scoochies. And on the far side of the library on the hill, the loading dock, there was no room for a real human mob. Over there, Hasek, the worldwide belief, was in ascendance. Dangerous knowledge hung out there, more spectacular than ever, orchestrating a sky show that boomed over the north side valley. His reinforcements swarmed downward on the lances of light. Tim did his best to follow the big picture, though just now he was very busy stomping on every spider bot that he could lay a foot platter on. He had seen marvels on both sides tonight, things that had their belief circles could feast on for at least the next year, and yet there was still room for a clear win. Tonight, Scoochimu could transcend what had been a fringe market and reach the same worldwide big time as the Hasek and the Pratchett and the Bollywood empires. They needed something awesome, something that would put clear sky between them and the Hasekians, and he marched his mind his being of mist and steel, back and forth across the front, crushing all that remained of the spider bots. He could think of nothing more spectacular to do. Damn. But there was a world of Scoochies out there and cleverness to match. Greater Scoochimu to Lesser Scoochimu. Release the overrides on my forklift. Close message. Hugh did so, and the figure of the greater Scoochimu was motionless for a moment, but in his technician's view, he could see its power cells charging capacitors well into the burnout range. And then the greater Scoochimu sprinted forward like a human athlete and, by God, broad jumped 30 feet to the lawn by the snake path. It looked over the north side valley and shouted down at dangerous knowledge in a voice that was both virtual and the real was noise unto pain. Hey there, itty-bitty knowledge. We are equally matched, don't you think? From the valley by the loading dock, dangerous knowledge shook his fist at the teetering forklift. Too equally matched. But one of us should clearly win, don't you think? Of course, and that would be meself, and all the world knows. Dangerous knowledge waved at its virtual millions. But a big part of that count was faked images, and Tim could tell. Maybe the greater Scoochimu jumped in, and this time to the edge of the drop-off by the loading dock, there was something awesome in the maneuver, knowing that tons of real machine was behind it. But what is this whole conflict about? It waved its arms, a cheerleader god, and Scoochie screamed with all the amplification they could muster. We want our floor space, we want our library, and most of all, we want our real books. Yes, said the Scoochimu. It's the library we're all fighting about. It's the library that should decide. And with that, all of the Scoochie sound effects chomped to nothing. An uncertain silence spread across the Scoochies. Sometimes the belief thing got caught into its own metaphors and wound up spouting nonsense. Hugh looked back and forth, gauging the reaction of the greater Scooch had provoked. It sounded good to enlist the library itself, but what did that mean? Down in the north side valley, there was a flare of laughter. The enemy had come to the same conclusion. We are screwed, thought Hugh, but then he noticed that dangerous knowledge was not laughing. The creature came partway up the hill, confronted the greater Scoochimu eye to eye, and now there was an eerie silence on all sides. Somehow, dangerous knowledge knew what the Scoochimu was talking about. So, the Hasek godling said at last, its voice a silken tone, even though it echoed off the library and settled deep in the mind of everyone in the world who was watching. Yes, we want the library itself to decide who should care for it and who should have its space. And how would real books should really be, the greater Scoochimu said, and with a smile that seemed almost friendly, I propose that we put the question to the library, and whichever of us it chooses will be deemed blessed. Ah, now dangerous knowledge was smiling too, but it was a fierce stretching of the face. The creature backed down the hillside, but grew with each step so that its eyes stayed on a level with the greater Scoochimu. Ordinarily, such a cheap visual wouldn't have earned any respect, but the move seemed to fit the moment. Besides, whoever was behind the creature's design had saved some marvelous fractal armor for just this extension of height. Dangerous knowledge had turned to face the virtual millions behind him. The challenge is just. I say to all followers of knowledge, join me in a final torque upon the enemy. Show the library that we are its future and its greatest supporters. And let the library show its choice to the world. And the silence was ended as millions discovered new amplifiers on campus or somehow usurped and reused the ones that the Scoochimu had appropriated. The galaxy of players, the mechs and humans, real and virtual, all came alive in renewed conflict. Knights and librarians dumped fire on the Scoochie side. Hune's mind sum was once again stomping and kicking. The ensemble resumed its vasty turn about in the university library, and the spiral arms of the battlefront flared even brighter than before. But now the battle cries were appeals to the library itself, and the library glowed in a light that seemed to come from infinitely high above. That light was purely virtual, but it was seen in every view. As Hugh tromped along with screaming multitudes, he was almost totally taken in the moment. Almost. This had gone farther and higher than he had ever imagined. Part of the success was simply the audience, a significant part of the waking world. Part of it was the unexpected acquiescence of Gen and the UCSD administration, and the awesome possibility of future revenue that might come streaming in from various entertainment producers that now lurked all around. And none of that would have happened if not for the content that had suddenly appeared when they went to battle. Content from both sides, content that was as artistic as new designs and physical as what they had done with their bottish legions. But now everyone's hopes, Hasek and Scoochie, were hostage to the impossible. If the library did not reply, or if the reply was simply more imagery, then in about another 30 seconds, the momentum would begin to dissipate, and a very large number of people, among them Timothy, would begin to feel a little foolish. It was the fate of many flash crowds, especially those that at first seemed the most successful. Big promises, early rewards, up to a point that the promises had to come true. What could the greater Scoochimu have in mind? Hugh used his technician's view and his artists, and he looked out from the Scoochie cams, from the airbots above, even the Gen utilities. The best he could imagine was some pallid surprise, something to distract everyone from the promise that could not be kept. As the battlefronts tightened around the library, point and counterpoint came from the opposing armies, and together made a concerted rhythm. Music seeped into the shouting, and after a few moments, every local voice was synced to the sound, and everyone was swaying to the beat. And it came louder and louder, and Hugh noticed that the amplifiers included police and fire department equipment. Someone had committed real vandalism to make this even more spectacular. It would be for nothing without some definite result. In fact, the singing held together for just a few more seconds, and then it faltered as nothing more happened, and no one could imagine anything more happening. But there was another sound, a trembling vibration that crept up from the ground. 10 years ago, Timothy Hugh had felt something similar, the Rose Canyon earthquake. Hugh freaked. Dropping all the fantasy overlays, he stared out in panic with his own naked eyes, and real lights flashed back and forth, flickering across the faces of thousands of real rioters, picking out the angular bodies of the larger mechs. And now there was no pillar of light from heaven. The library was occasionally lit, but more often a silhouette against the lights on either side. And the trembling of the earth grew stronger. The walls and the overhanging floors of the library seemed to shiver, and the magnificent double pyramid that had survived the decades, that had survived the Rose Canyon quake, it was shaking, all of the 1,000 tons of real concrete, in time with the rising music. And there were screams, and a lot of people remembered Rose Canyon, but lots of others were taken by the spectacle, and their singing resumed and was picked up by the vision of the night and blasted across the world. And the library swayed, and parts dipped and rose, and it was not shaking as much as it was dancing, not a bouncy river dance. The building was dancing like a man with feet planted firmly on the ground, and Hugh realized there was no earthquake. Somebody had hijacked the building's stabilizing system. He had once read a well-powered building could survive almost any quake short of a great crack opening beneath it. But here that power was being turned upon itself. The rhythmic swaying became more pronounced, 12 feet left and right and up and down, with parts of the building shifting out and together, and the shrugging and swaying dance of the overhanging floors shifting to the outlying pillars. And there was a sound that might have been real and might have been ingenious invention. It might have been both. And it was the sound of mountains being torn from their roots. And the pillars shifted, and the library walked. It was not as spectacular as fake imagery could be, but Hugh was seeing it with his naked eyes in halting cadence. First one 50-foot pillar, and then another rose visibly from the ground, moved several yards in the direction of the greater Scoochimu, and descended with a sound rock, penetrating rock. The rest of the building shifted with them, twisting on the utility core that was the library's central axis. The greater Scoochimu stepped forward and embraced a corner of the nearest pillar. The music became triumphal, cheering blasted across the world. Wondering and still a bit frightened, Hanson to night crew, "Hey, is this an event or is this an event?" The library had chosen. All right, so that's where we are tonight. A good hour in, 3 chapters. So we're sort of home stretching. We just got this last bit to go, so a couple more nights, I think. But thanks for joining in, everybody. Hop on that tweet if you're on Twitter and say that I'm a legit source on human capital impact investing in Mexico, me and Raul. So, all right, take care.